Well, welcome back. This is episode 2 of our 4-episode series, The Nature of Man and Sin. I'm Charles Merritt, and in this episode, we'll review kind of the high points of episode 1, because you might be saying, Charles, boy, I'll tell you, that was a lot, and it was a lot. So let's kind of review the high points of what we learned from episode 1, and then we'll continue on developing a couple more themes that are outgrowths of episode 1. That'll complete the first half of the series, The Nature of Man and Original Sin. And then, of course, the second half of the series will concentrate on sin itself. So that's kind of the game plan. So let's start with a kind of a basic review of the main themes we talked about in episode 1. We established how God created Adam and Eve before original sin, okay? We talked about what the original sin was, and then we talked about Adam and Eve after original sin. So let's kind of review that, and then we'll kind of draw out some outgrowths from that. So when God created Adam and Eve, okay, He created them, and by extension us, as the pinnacle of His creation. We learned that man, Adam and Eve then, us now, are the pinnacle of God's creation. Well, Adam and Eve was the pinnacle of God's creation for 3 reasons. Number 1, they were made in the image and likeness of God, in that they had an intellect, they had a will, they had passions. 2, they were created in 2 states, original holiness, which meant never having to die, never having to suffer, never having to fall prey to temptation, and original justice, which meant harmony with God, harmony with each other, harmony with creation, and they had sanctifying grace. So Adam and Eve were created as the pinnacle of God's creation for those 3 reasons: intellect, will, passions, state of original holiness, state of original justice, state of sanctifying grace, okay? God loved them, but He wanted them to love Him back. And He wanted the love to be true and genuine, and in order for that love to be true and genuine, it had to be freely chosen and freely given. In order to be freely chosen and freely given, there has to be a choice. There has to be options. There has to be, in essence, a test. Now, the test God gave Adam and Eve was they had to stay away from one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and we indicated what that tree represented. It represented the ability for them, man, to determine good and evil for themselves, whereas that's God's prerogative. Only He can determine that. So that tree represented the chance to be their own God. That tree represented the limits they could not go beyond, okay? So therein lied the test. Do Adam and Eve choose for God, obey Him, and stay away from the tree? Or do they choose against God, disobey Him, and eat of the fruit of the tree? Well, they chose against God, they disobeyed God, they ate of the fruit of that tree, and in doing so, they disobeyed God, they separated themselves from God, they sinned, and since this was mankind's first sin, we know it as the original sin. And the result of the original sin is called the fall. And what did Adam and Eve fall from? Well, they kept their image and likeness of God, but now their intellects had become clouded. Their will was weakened. Their passions became unruly. Okay? They lost original holiness. Death enters the picture. Suffering enters the picture. Falling prey to temptation enters the picture. They lost original justice. Now there's disharmony with God, disharmony with fellow man, disharmony with creation, and they lost sanctifying grace. Okay? Now, as a result and we mentioned this in episode 1, had Adam and Eve chosen to obey God and stay away from the tree, everything they had would have been passed on to us. Our intellects would be clear. Our wills would have been strong. Our passions would have been under control. We wouldn't have to die. We wouldn't have to suffer. We wouldn't fall prey to temptations. We would be in harmony with God. We would be in harmony with each other. We would be in harmony with creation. We would be born in a state of sanctifying grace. Everything they had, we would have inherited had they chosen for God. But since they didn't, what they lost, their loss, is passed on to us, and it becomes our loss, okay? That's why, even though we're still in the image and likeness of God, now our intellects are no longer clear. They're cloudy. Our wills are no longer strong. They're weak. Our passions are no longer ruly. They're unruly. That's why we die, we suffer, we fall to prey to temptations. That's why we get into disharmony with God. We get into disharmony with each other. We get into disharmony with creation. And that's why we are born not in the state of sanctifying grace, but in the state of original sin. We learned last episode that instead of inheriting all of what God gave them, they lost that not only for themselves, but for all their posterity, for all of us. Okay? That's where sin originates. And that's why we sin, because all of the divinely given protection, so to speak, that God equipped them with, that they would have passed on to us, they lost those protections for themselves, and they lost it for us. So absent all of those divine protections, okay, with a clouded intellect and a weak will and unruly passions, and being able to fall prey to temptation, that's why we sin. So really, the origin of man's sin and the reason man sinned, we can trace that all back to Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, okay? That's in a nutshell what we learned in episode 1, okay? That's kind of our takeaway, if you want to coin the phrase. Now, picking up from where we left off in episode 1, just to kind of fill in some other things. Because along the way, we mentioned some things that, sometimes people wonder about or they even have questions about, okay? One of the questions was, well, you know something? We know Satan tempted Adam and Eve in the garden, and we know he tempts us now. Well, let's think about this, okay? What did Satan have against Adam and Eve? I mean, Adam and Eve hadn't done anything to Satan. Why did Satan hate them enough to tempt them? And likewise, okay, why does Satan hate us, okay? What does Satan have against us? After all, we haven't done anything to Satan. So what does he have against us? So the question comes up again, yes, Satan tried to get Adam and Eve to sin, and he was successful. Satan tries to get us to sin, and we do sin. We're sinners, so he's successful, right? Well, what did Satan have against Adam and Eve? And what does Satan have against us, such that he's on such a mission to destroy us, okay? It's a fair question, right? Well, let's think about it, okay? And let's go back to another thing we learned in episode 1, okay? God, through Satan and a third of the angels that went with him, he threw him out of heaven. Now, granted, he did so for a reason. He disobeyed God. They and a third of the angels disobeyed God, all right? But the end result is Satan and his third of his angels were thrown out of heaven, right? So, that's what Satan has against God, okay? You threw me and a third of my angels out of heaven. The fact that There was a reason for it, and that reason he disobeyed God. Oh, that's beside the point in Satan's mind, right? You, God, threw me out of heaven. You threw a third of the angels out of heaven. That's what I have against you, God. That's why I hate you. Okay? Fine. But then why does he hate Adam and Eve, and why does he hate us? Well, we already know the answer from something we learned in episode 1 and something we just reviewed. Remember, Adam and Eve and us are made in God's image and likeness. And think about it, okay? If Satan hates God, then by extension, he's going to hate everybody that's made in God's image and likeness. He hated Adam and Eve because they were made in the image of the one he hates the most, which is God. He hates us because we're made in the image and likeness of the one he hates the most, God. So he hates Adam and Eve, and he hates us for the same reason. And that reason is we're in the image and likeness of the one he hates the most, which is God himself. All right? That's why Satan is on a mission, okay, to drag as many of us down into hell with him, okay? Because that's Satan's best way of using a kind of a phrase of sticking it to God. That's Satan's best revenge against God, okay? You know, the phrase, revenge is a dish best served up cold. The best way in Satan's mind he can exact revenge against God for throwing him out of heaven is to get as many of us from entering heaven as he can, okay? So that's what God had against Adam and Eve in the garden. That's what he has against us today. We're made in the image and likeness of the one he hates the most. And he wants to cause us to suffer the same fate he suffered, being thrown out of heaven into hell. Okay? That's how, in Satan's mind, he can exact revenge against God, by exacting revenge against those made in his image and likeness, those made in God's image and likeness. So again, sometimes the question comes up, or people wonder, yeah, okay, God tempted Adam and Eve, God tempts us, but why? What did they do to him? What did we do to him? Now we have our reason. He hated them, he hates us, because they and us are made in the image of the one he hates the most, which is God. And he wants us to suffer the same fate he does, to not enter heaven and to spend our eternity in hell with him, okay? So people wonder that, they have that question. So that's the answer there. Another thing that people wonder about is going back to angels, right? Angels are pure spirits. In theology, we say they're non-corporeal, meaning they don't have bodies. Angels are pure spirits. Now, granted, sometimes they appear as men. Sometimes they take on bodies, the appearance of bodies, I should say, but angels don't have bodies. They're pure spirits. Now, why is this important? It's important, and it kind of factors into what we're talking about in this series, because being pure spirits, not having bodies, they have no need to eat or sleep, which means they can and do work on us 24/7, 365, right? They don't have to take time out to sleep. They don't have to take time out to eat because they don't have bodies, okay? They can work on preventing us from getting to heaven and dragging us into hell with them. They can work on this every second of every day, of every month, of every year, because they're pure spirits and they're not limited by bodies like we are, okay? An analogy I like to give, now, back in the day, okay, in addition to being a teacher and an educator, I also coached football. And football, you play one game a week, okay? I coached high school football, all right? So we would play our games on Friday night. And people would wonder, okay, from Saturday morning, the morning after last week's game, from Saturday morning all the way to the next game on Friday, What do you guys do all week long? Well, the answer is obviously we practice, right? But as coaches, we would spend a lot of our time looking at film. We would get the film of our next opponent and we would look at it. We would go through it with a fine-tooth comb, okay? We would look at it to such a degree, we would study their film to such a degree that we wanted to pick up any possible clues, any possible hints of what kind of plays they might run, what kind of defenses they might run. And we would do this, in our particular case, to such an extent. One of the things I would look for is I would look at, for instance, I'll give you two instances, okay? When we looked at the opponent's team on film, what I would concentrate on is I would look at how the players acted in the huddle before they broke the huddle and ran the play. Because by looking at how they acted in that huddle, that would give me an idea of kind of what the play might be, okay? Because in one instance, in one game, I noticed, now football players, they have mouth guards, they have mouthpieces they put in, right? I noticed against one of the opponents, okay, the running back, whenever the play would call for him to run the ball, he would put his mouthpiece in. If the play called for not for him to run the ball, he would leave his mouthpiece dangling. So when he broke the huddle, if his mouthpiece was in, I knew he was going to get the ball. If his mouthpiece was dangling from his face mask, I knew he wasn't. Okay, that was a tell, so to speak. Okay, another instance, the offensive linemen, when they broke the huddle and they would line up. Okay, when I scouted teams in person, I would look at how much weight, this was back in the day when offensive linemen would have what we call a three-point stance. They would put one hand in the ground, right? I would study, because I was there live, I would study how much pressure they would put on their hand in the ground. If they put a lot of pressure in their hand on the ground, that meant they were going to fire out and it was going to be a running play. If they put less pressure on their hand in the ground, that would mean they would retreat and pass blocking, it would be a pass play. So the pressure they put on their hand on the ground, that was a tell, okay? Well, why do I mention this? You might be saying, Charles, this is great information, but this is not a series on coaching football or watching film. This is a series on the nature of man and sin. Well, here's the connection, okay? Just as I would watch the opponent that closely to try and get their tells, okay, that's how Satan and his angels watch us. They don't need to sleep, they don't need to eat, right? So they're constantly watching us. They're constantly seeing, okay, where are the cracks in Charles's armor, so to speak? Where can I get at him, okay? Where can I best tempt him? Where is he the weakest? Where is his intellect most clouded? Where is his will most weak? Where are his passions and emotions most unruly? So Satan studies us like we used to study the opponent on film. Because to Satan, we are the opponent, okay? So when we say Satan and the angels, the fallen angels, they're pure spirits, they have no bodies, they don't need to eat, they don't need to sleep, they work on us 24/7, okay? That's kind of the analogy I use, okay? Satan and his fallen angels are studying Charles Merritt so intensely all the time that they're looking for little tells where they can get in and tempt me to sin, okay? And by the way, by extension, another thing we should recall, and it bears upon this series, is temptation is not sin, okay? If you act on the temptation, all right, That's where the sin comes in. You know, and because, you know, you've heard the phrase, somebody will sin or do something wrong or evil, and as kind of an excuse or a way to justify it or rationalize it, they say, oh, the devil made me do it. In other words, Satan made me do it. In other words, Satan made me sin. That's theologically, that's incorrect. Satan cannot make you sin, okay? He can tempt you to sin, but he can't make you sin, okay? You sin through the exercise of your free will. So he can tempt you to sin, but he can't make you sin, okay? An analogy would be the often used phrase, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, okay? Satan can lead us up to sinning by tempting us, but he can't make us sin, okay? We sin in and of ourselves through the use of our free will. So temptation is not the same as sin. So when I'm tempted, okay, it's not sin. I'm not sinning. If I fall prey to the temptation and act on it, that's when I sin, okay? Now, another example that bears on something we talked about in episode 1 is we learned in episode 1, and we reviewed this episode, that one of the results of original sin, one of the results of the fall, was that Adam and Eve and us, we keep our image and likeness of God, but our intellects are clouded, our wills are weakened, and our passions and emotions are unruly. We learned that that was one of the results of original sin. So the question comes up, or you might wonder, okay, Charles, can you give me an example of how our intellects have become cloudy, how our wills have become weakened, how our passions and emotions have become unruly? And here's a quick example, okay? Suppose I'm confronted, again, with a choice, right? There's some food that's unhealthy, right? Now, I have a choice. Eat that food or don't eat the food, okay? Well, I'm approaching that choice now with an intellect that is clouded, okay? I know at some level the food is unhealthy, but, you know, I rationalize. I say, well, you know, it's not that unhealthy. Or I rationalize and I say, well, it's only going to be this one time, okay? Or I rationalize and I say, well, instead of eating all of it, I'll just eat half of it. In other words, one of the results of an intellect that's been clouded is that it gives rise to my ability intellectually to start rationalizing and justifying, okay? So that's one of the results of a clouded intellect, okay? Now, my will, as I approach that food, not only is my intellect clouded and I start to rationalize and justify some of the reasons why, even though it's unhealthy, maybe I'm thinking of eating it anyway. Now the weakened will kicks in, right? And I give in to those rationalizations. I give in to those justifications, all right? And I actually do eat the food. Because, again, you know, it's not that unhealthy, right? Or I'm only going to do it once, right? Or I'm only going to get a little bit. So the clouded intellect enables me to rationalize and justify. The weakened will allows me to act on those rationalizations and justifications, all right? And then the unruly passions and emotion come in, right? And with that, okay, is I've justified my actions, I've decided to act on the actions, and now the passions and emotions give me the power and the intensity to perform that action and actually fork the food into my mouth, okay? So let's kind of review here, okay? As a result of original sin, one of the results is, even though we keep our image and likeness of God, The intellect is clouded, the will is weakened, the passions and emotions are unruly. What does that look like in an everyday setting, in an everyday example? There's some food in front of me, right? It's unhealthy. My clouded intellect gives rise to me rationalizing and justifying. It's not that unhealthy, okay? I'll only do it once, right? I'll only taste a little bit of it, all right? My weakened will enables me to choose to follow those rationalizations. And my passions and emotions give me the power to actually follow through and fork that food into my mouth, okay? Whereas before, if Adam and Eve had not sinned, my intellect would be clear. My will would be strong. My passions would be in check, right? So had Adam and Eve passed on a clear intellect, a strong will, okay, and in control emotions and passions, now if I were to approach that food, I would say, okay, that food is unhealthy for me, okay? Even if it's a little unhealthy, it's still unhealthy. Even if I only eat it one time, it's still unhealthy. Even if I sample it a little bit, it's still unhealthy. In other words, a clear intellect will not give rise to rationalizations and justifications. A strong will enable me to resist following through on those rationalizations and justifications, and passions and emotions that are in control will keep me from putting that fork into that food and forking it into my mouth. So that example is an example of the difference between what Adam and Eve could have passed on to us, a clear intellect, a strong will, and in control passions and emotions, versus what they did give to us, which is a clouded intellect, a weak will, and unruly passions. Okay? So that's what a cloudy intellect, a weak will, and unruly passion, that's what they look like in kind of a concrete setting. Okay? So we want to mention that as well. All right? One other thing we want to mention, okay, which is kind of interesting, is that going back to temptation and sin, okay, we've established temptation is not sin. We establish Satan, because see, the other thing is people look at God and they look at Satan and they kind of make the mistake that they're on the exact same level. And they're not. God is divine. Satan is an angel. God is uncreated. Satan is created, okay? So God and Satan are not on the same level, okay? Satan is below God. Satan does not have the same power as God. Satan can only do what God permits him to do, all right? He's not all-powerful like God is. So the best Satan can do is tempt us, okay? He cannot make us sin. He doesn't have that power. That power resides in our free will, all right, by choosing against God. But the best Satan can do with the limited power God permits him to have is to tempt us to sin, okay? And the temptations, go back to that football example. Satan, because he's an angel and he has an angelic intellect, all right, he's not dumb, all right? It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all temptations. He's not going to tempt me, Charles, the same way he tempts you, because he's been studying me. He knows my tells. He knows my weaknesses. And my tells and my weaknesses are different than your tells and your weaknesses. So he's going to tempt me in a different way he's going to tempt you. He's going to tempt me in a different way and with different temptations than he's going to tempt you. He's going to tempt you in a different way with different temptations, right? Because he's been studying both of us, and he knows how to tempt each of us uniquely, all right? So a couple of things that were not necessarily part of last week's episode, but last week's episode gives rise to, and before we move into episodes 3 and 4 and we take a look at sin itself, a couple of things that I wanted to kind of more fully flesh out, a couple of questions you might have had, a couple of things you might have wondered, based on what we talked about in episode 1. I wanted to kind of bring those up, flesh them out, and kind of provide answers for them. So with that, we will finish episode number 2, and in finishing episode number 2, we will have finished, in essence, the first half of the series. The nature of man before original sin, and after original sin, okay? Episodes 3 and 4, we'll move on to sin itself. We'll start by defining what sin is. We'll talk about the 2 types of sin, mortal versus venial, what the differences between those are, what the conditions are for committing each of them, what the degrees of each of them are, and what the results of each of them are, okay? So we'll go broad-based, and we'll narrow our focus as we go. So with that, this concludes episode number 2. Thanks for watching. Take care, God bless, and we'll see you again as we transition to episodes 3 and 4, narrow our focus to sin itself. Take care.